Hey y'all, Mike Rogle here with Organizational Behavior. We are moving on from individual characteristics now into group mechanisms, and we're going to start in the team part of group mechanisms and focus here on team characteristics.
Together we stand. Together we stand. Together we fall. Together we stand. Together we stand. United. Box up 3. 1, 2, 3. Box.
Team characteristics will be, a little boring. Mainly because we're talking through definitional things that will help set up more conversations as we move into other team conversations. And we'll break this up into 4 categories. We'll talk about team types. We'll talk about team development, team interdependence, like how the team works together. That'll be important to intentionally focus on to make sure that our teams are achieving their desired outcomes. And then team composition, things like team diversity, the capabilities of individuals within the teams, and how we balance that out to create desired outcomes. Let's start with team types. Now, we're not going to focus a ton on this. This is just going to be mainly definitional. We'll provide some context, and then we'll move forward. And let's start with the idea that we've got long-term teams and shorter-term teams. Let's start off with our longer-term or our longer lifespan teams, our work teams and our management teams. Work teams are the folks that we work shoulder to shoulder with. They're the ones that we typically think of when we are joining an organization. So I join XYZ company and I go work as a human resources person for the human resources team in that particular region or whatever it is. And those are the folks that I'm going to work with in that job, if I stay in that job. I'm going to work with relatively permanently to create some sort of a service for an organization. Now, if I joined a production team, I would work relatively permanently with that team because it's the very place of my job within that team to create some sort of a finished good or a product for an organization. So shoulder to shoulder, we work closely with these folks to try to relatively permanently to try to create some sort of a product or service. The next is our management team. This is another relatively permanent team that works together, performing managerial tasks across the organization. So they're tying all of our organization together and helping to make decisions and make sure that everything's flowing and working together correctly to create our end outcomes, and performing managerial tasks to do so and coordinating together to make it all work. I've been a part of some management teams and executive teams, and tell you what, they are incredibly challenging to work with, because if I'm the COO, the Chief Operating Officer, I'm focused on my teams, right? If I'm the HR person, I'm focused on my teams. If I'm the CFO, I'm focused on the accounting and finance and all that, and sales, Chief Marketing or Sales Officer, I'm focused on those things. Then you have a Chief Executive Officer, or however your management team's structured, and there can be management teams at different levels of organizations that, well, I'm using an executive team as my example. It's difficult because everybody's looking at things through the lens of their particular organization. And you all have to sacrifice a little bit to create the best possible end outcome. I can do things as a chief operating officer that can create the most efficiency, the lowest cost per unit, the best whatever, and whatever our focuses are, our goals are, I can focus my organization and create those things. But they might be at the sacrifice of doing what our customers want. So it might impact our sales team. I can, from a human resources standpoint, I can go and create all these great little HR programs and manage my organization, my work teams really, really well. But if they don't serve everybody else and give them what they want and what they need as an organization, then I'm not doing my job as well. So that management team has to find out how to balance all of our activities together, prioritize them because we can't do everything in order to create desired outcomes. Now let's move on to some of our shorter cycle teams. And what I mean by shorter cycle is it doesn't mean that their lifespan is short. Some of these lifespans, or at least one of them, can be longer term, but they don't need to meet all the time. And so one of our shorter term types of teams is a parallel team. These are folks that get together like a quality control team to try to problem solve and make recommendations for how to improve a particular function like quality control. So folks that might be within, similar types of work teams, it could be cross-functional teams as well, all get together to try to solve particular types of problems. We would have like safety committees or quality control teams, or we had process improvement teams that would get together once every 2 weeks at one organization. When we implemented our full e-business suite in 2002, I think it was, we implemented Oracle. And we had a lot of issues we had to troubleshoot through the implementation, but also through the ongoing changes that need to be made to make sure we were maximizing utilization of that system. So you had folks that from every part of the organization coming together that represented particular modules that would troubleshoot on a regular basis things that we thought we wanted to do as an organization from a systematic standpoint. And they would come up with a recommendation, and we'd take that to the management team, and they would, make decisions on that. And that would be a parallel team that worked together on a kind of a semi-regular basis. That wasn't part of their work team. It wasn't part of their management team. It was just this team that got together to solve particular problems on a semi-regular basis. The next type of shorter-term team might be a project team, and these can meet all the time for a short lifespan, and they can not meet all the time for short lifespans as well, but they're typically shorter lifespans focused on getting a project off the ground and to completion. And we would use these for like implementation of particular pieces of equipment at an organization where, we'd have everybody who we thought could provide some sort of a desired outcome or input to desired outcome help to implement a particular production line. So we'd have people that were focused on the safety part of it. We'd have people who were focused on the job design part of it. We'd have people who were focused on the mechanical part of it. All those folks would come together and we try to work through, well, what's the best way to implement this particular piece of equipment through its design and implementation, and then finally until it is fully being utilized. And we try to think of every aspect possible to make sure that when we kicked that thing off and we were getting running, that it was producing the best possible outcomes. And then once that was done, that project team was done. And so we do this with a lot of implementation things or things that, urgent issues that pop up to say, hey, we've got quality control issues in this particular area. We need to bring together a team, focus on particularly that particular problem, solve that problem, and move on. Legal issues, we usually have project teams working on legal issues, all sorts of things that have a particular definitive end date usually accumulate a project team. The last one are action teams. I like to think of this as like a surgery team. So I might be part of a particular group of nurses, and somebody else might be a part of a group of surgeons, and somebody else is part of an anesthesiology department. Those are their work groups. But when they all come together to perform an action, a surgery, they are part of an action team. And so it's people who come together to perform a particular action that is, can be regularly scheduled, and they all come together as a team to perform that particular action. Now, why is it important to think about teams or team types? Few reasons. One, it helps to organize the rest of our thoughts when we think about their interdependence and things like that and how we design them. Secondly, it helps to organize, like work teams will help to organize who reporting relationships go to. But also when we think about individual mechanisms, specifically when we talk about job satisfaction, let's look at organizing work as part of job satisfaction or reorganizing work in order to create higher job satisfaction. Well, one way to do that would be, remember, through job enlargement and job enrichment. So what we can do to create maybe some job enrichment is to take somebody who's part of a work team and say, hey, I want you to be part of this project team, or I want you to be part of this action team, or hey, I'd love you to be part of this parallel team that goes and solves regular problems and gives you depth of responsibility. So now you've created job enrichment that hopefully might create some job satisfaction. That's how all this kind of plays into individual mechanisms and then plays into potential overall job performance. But there are other things to think of. Like how we organize supervision will highly be driven by our work teams. and how we organize that. How we do incentives. Oh boy, oh boy. Have I been successful at this, and have I been not successful at this in the past as well? So if we think about how we structure like a bonus, maybe team bonuses, how I individual my work teams will be different than how I incentivize my work teams will be different than how I incentivize my management teams. Because I want my management teams thinking longer term. I want my work teams potentially to think more shorter term, a year or less. And I want them executing on a regular basis. But my management teams, I don't want them thinking a year or less. That would be devastating for our company. I want them thinking 10 years, 15 years out, 20 years out, depending on what our goals are. I want them thinking big, hairy, audacious goals that are long-term success focused. Because if they're only focused on short-term success, they could burn down the organization like that. And so these ways of thinking and how organizing teams help us to influence our individual mechanisms, which then help to influence, hopefully, our performances as a whole. Next, we'll start focusing on team development. And we'll spend a little bit more time on this because I just think it's more important and more practically applicable for y'all. So when we think about team development, we're going to focus on 3 ways of thinking or 3 models of team development. And these aren't mutually exclusive. They're just looking at things from different angles. And we'll look at things through a kind of a sequential team development process, one from a kind of a less linear or less sequential, and then some processes that we can work through, which we've already talked about, 5 dysfunctions of a team, in hopes to create desired outcomes. The first kind of model of team development we'll look through is kind of a more of a sequential process. And we're going to call these the 5 ings: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Pretty amazing how that works out. Add ing onto the end of the things. You could do any 5 ings, but these are the 5 ings we're going to focus on. And let's first focus on forming.
Form feet and legs. Form arms and body. And all form the head.
Now, do things always happen in a sequence? No. But maybe it's just a way to think through, well, if I got a team, what should I do to try to kind of help navigate through the development of this team? And this first thing that we'll talk about is forming. That's the first stage where we define what's expected of each other. Like, what do we need to accomplish, and what are our roles and responsibilities? What are our behaviors? What are the boundaries of our roles? What are the boundaries of our team? And what are our overall responsibilities? It's providing some sort of form and format to help us know, kind of doing job design for us within that particular team to try to say, well, what are we trying to accomplish, and define how we're going to get there and what our roles and responsibilities and boundaries are. It's great. It's easy to do. Well, I shouldn't say easy. It's probably the easiest thing to do out of all of this. It's just to plan it and process it and think through it, and that's all great. But that leads to our second stage of team development, which is storming, which is ultimately people bring things to the table, all as individuals. I bring my own perspectives. I also bring junk to the table that won't be helpful for the team. Maybe I disagree with how the team was formed, and I think I should be doing this, and that person over there stinks at that. And suddenly we have conflict. And that conflict arises based off of the things that all of us individuals bring to the table that don't really align well within all the little buckets that we've created during our forming session. One of my favorite sayings of all time, and this is something that you can take with you for the rest of your life, is that no plan survives the battlefield, and certainly no forming survives team development as well. You'll ultimately end up with some conflict. And this is where, again, defining roles is really important. When you say who is the team lead, that team lead needs to step up, and others need to step up as well to try to help to navigate through that storming part. And we'll talk about that in a second when we talk about 5 dysfunctions of a team. Then we look at norming. Norming is where we realize, holy smokes, we need to work together. So hopefully we've guided well through the conflict process, which will, again, ultimately happen. Sometimes conflict can be great. Sometimes it can be damaging, and somebody needs to help to manage through that, or we need to manage through that together. But ultimately, if we do that well, we realize we need to work together and coordinate to begin to accomplish our desired outcomes. And we start to fall into our roles, the places we need to be to create those desired outcomes. If we're doing that well, again, this is ideal team development through a sequence. Doesn't always happen ideally. Some people don't fall into that norming process. You end up just storming all the way throughout and don't create the most efficient, effective team as possible. And then hopefully we get to performing, where we settle into our roles, not only do that through the norming process, but we actually start to work together and start to create desired outcomes, the ones that we're meant to create by the very nature of the formation of our team. And once we do all of our performing, eventually, no team lasts forever. Remember, even work teams, they're relatively permanent. At some point, that team adjourns, or people adjourn from the team. And managing that well is pretty darn important. I can still remember when I adjourned from my first executive team, and it was incredibly emotional. I was leaving the organization, and it was an incredibly emotional time for me, for the CEO, the CFO, the people that I'd worked shoulder to shoulder with on a regular basis, my work teams. And that adjourning that process was incredibly important to the members of our team that helped to create further, at least for the people that stuck around, further organizational commitment as well, which is, again, a desired performance outcome. So forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, those are the sequential kind of processes of a team. Now let's move to the kind of the less linear processes. The next term is punctuated equilibrium, and this is a less linear kind of part of thinking. It doesn't mean that it's mutually exclusive from kind of our sequential process. We can still go through our forming and storming and norming and all that stuff. But eventually, sometimes as teams, we hit what we call inertia, where we just start coasting. And we perform things, maybe now we're just performing, we've normed, and now we perform, and we're just going along, and we hit a period of time where we don't change anything. And at some point, variables change around us. And as variables change around us and we don't change behavior, we may eventually come to a moment where we realize, holy smokes, we are not performing the way that we need to. Maybe we never have, maybe we did and we don't anymore, but we've now hit a moment where something has happened and it awakens us to this realization that we are not accomplishing our desired outcomes and we need to change. And then through that, the organization changes or the team changes, and then they fall into new ways of behaving that create desired outcomes, new roles, new responsibilities, new mechanisms of behaving. All that stuff can create desired outcomes. One of the best examples of this was the first executive team that I was on. I was still relatively young. I was still relatively new to the team. I was only maybe 2 years in. And it was the fall of 2008. And in the fall of 2008, for those of you who remember that time, a lot of you might not, but we entered into a recession, kind of a worldwide recession. And I was in a business that was exporting a lot of material. And as the recession hit, imports started to drop, which means exports, there were no ships that were there to export. So it was more difficult to ship product. We had a currency exchange issue with the dollar, especially in the Far East. So that was creating issues with buying power of our customers. All that stuff was impacting our ability to perform. And we were preparing for our executive team meeting, as we always did. And so all of us went off and gathered our quarterly data and brought it back, and we were going through our meetings. And the CEO stood up in the middle of the meeting and said, "Time out. Listen, I can go off and basically disband this whole team, disband this whole company. I can take all of my assets and go create a small company, cash out a bunch of stuff and take a few of those assets, go create a smaller version of this company and make more money than you all are making for me right now." And I was like, we're looking around going like, what? It's like, I need you to change how you're thinking. I need to change how you're behaving together to create better outcomes. And we'll get together tomorrow and we'll come back to the drawing table. Anyways, we disbanded as a group. Our executive team outside of the CEO went to the bar that night, and we all hung out. We tried to problem solve. How can we be better teammates together? And we went through a process, or initiated a process. We hit that punctuated equilibrium moment. We went through a process, reformed how we were going to work together, how we were going to struggle through issues together, how we were going to be more honest with each other, all that stuff, how we were going to prepare our information and bring better external information. All that from that moment changed and led to a few of the most profitable years that organization had ever seen. This last one is the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And again, these are all not mutually exclusive. They can all kind of work together to think through how we develop teams. And this is less of a sequential process and more of what are some qualities of a team that we need to achieve together. And the book that it comes from, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Pat Lencioni, focuses on the lack of, like, what are the things that create dysfunction, but the opposite of those are the ones that create hopefully better functional teams. So the first dysfunction would be a lack of trust, which would mean that hopefully we have good trust. So if we're looking at things that we want to have vulnerable trust with each other. Second would be lack of constructive conflict. That is vital through those storming times. So we can form, and that's great. And hopefully we build enough trust so that when we start storming, when things don't go as right as we had planned, when the plan does not survive the battlefield, we can then hopefully work through issues constructively. Because we have vulnerable trust and we trust in each other enough to step on each other's toes and know that we're not doing it with ill will and ill intent, then we can hopefully constructively work through that storming period through constructive conflict. And then hopefully we can get commitment. And through commitment, we can say, okay, here's where we're going to go. That's our norming time. And then we start performing, and then hopefully we get results. So commitment. So let's start with the beginning. Trust, constructive conflict, commitment, accountability. We hold each other accountable, and then we get results at the very end of the day. Let's talk about team interdependence. Now, we're not going to cover a lot of the ways teams interact. We'll cover that really quick definitionally, but I want to talk about what binds teams together, what pulls them together, which is goal interdependence and outcome interdependence. So let's first focus on these quick definitions on how teams interact and then move on to what binds us together. The first way that teams can be interdependently entwined together is through comprehensive interdependence. That's like a parallel team that brings together a bunch of different functions together to do process improvement. And everybody shares their information, and collectively, comprehensively, all that information comes together to be refined into an end outcome that is their result, whether it's a product or service. Then you have a reciprocal team. And this would be more like if I had an overall project and I say, okay, I need to create little subgroups. And subgroup 1 of 2 people, subgroup 2 has 2 people, 3 and 4 have all 2 people. And I'm going to send you all out to do different things that you need to do. And then collectively we'll bring it all together. And then our end outcome that we bring all together will be our result. We do that for I would do this with job design projects where I'd collect a whole bunch of groups of people, split them into smaller groups. And then in their small groups, they would go out to different regions of the organization. We'd come back and collectively we would have an overall job design outcome because of all the reciprocal interdependence that was all brought together and utilized for an end outcome. Then we have sequential. Sequential would be like a production line where you tip over the dominoes and somebody does domino 1, somebody does domino 2, somebody does domino 3, and so forth and so on until the end result is accomplished. It's in a sequence. And teams can be constructed that way a lot of times when you're creating some sort of in a production line, creating some sort of a product typically. Or things that are driven by a process, like we have process things in our forms. And in form number 1, somebody fills out X, presses submit, and then it goes to somebody else. And they fill out the second part of that form, and then submit goes to somebody else, and then somebody approves it. That would be a team that works sequentially on some sort of process approval. And then you have pooled. interdependence. Pooled would be where everybody goes out and does their individual thing, and then it pools together to create some sort of an outcome. So pooled interdependence, let's see. I've had teams where we would do this, where we would go out and say, okay, we're going to split this project into 5 things. You do section 1, you do section 2, and we can all do them at our own leisure. By the time that the due date is needed, we all bring it together collectively, piece it together as a collage of all of our work, and that creates the outcome. And that would be pooled interdependence. But what I really want to focus on is the ways that we can bind those teams together through interdependence upon our goals, interdependence with our outcomes. Interdependence with our goals we have shared purpose. So we're all paddling in the same direction, focused on the same end outcome, the same goal. The more that we can, within our work teams or our management teams, especially our management teams, let's focus on that. The more that we can focus them on having a shared goal, the more likelihood we are of accomplishing those desired goals, right? So in my management team, I'll certainly want them to have goals for their departments. But ultimately, their goal together is not to accomplish their goals in their departments. They may have to sacrifice some of those in order to accomplish the overall end outcome. And so that will lead into shared outcome or outcome interdependence. This fact that we can all see the feedback or hear the feedback of the end outcome of that goal. So we have a vision or shared vision of what actually occurs. And then we also potentially share in the rewards of that. So if I have a management team and they have a shared goal, and then they all have their team goals as well, I might actually tell that team, hey, we are going to more heavily weight the rewards for you from a shared or an outcome interdependent standpoint into the management team outcomes itself, not for your organizational outcomes. Those will have their own rewards as well. But I'm going to heavily weight the rewards or the outcomes for you from a reward standpoint into your management team incentives that we're trying to pool our efforts together to create these outcomes for the organization. So when we think about tying our teams together, we want to try to tie them together with a shared purpose and also a shared vision of the outcome so they can see the outcomes and also have a shared reward. I say a vision or a feedback of the outcomes because a lot of times, especially with let's say you're on a pooled team, you all do your individual effort and you all pool together your resources and you create an outcome, and then the outcome gets taken somewhere and presented or whatever it is. And then maybe only a couple of members hear back and not all of them. And you wonder what the heck? Put all that effort into this and I never heard back. I got one buddy who just went through that the other day. And he came back, he's like, man, I put all this effort into all this work. It went into this black hole somewhere and I never heard about it again. And he was pretty upset, naturally, because he didn't have any outcome interdependence with that. They didn't all get to share in the feedback of that particular outcome. And certainly you want to have reward interdependence. I can think of a time when we implemented our first organization-wide incentive, a profit-sharing incentive. And we started only offering it to our office employees. And it just, it never felt right from the beginning, but we were looking at affordability. We wanted to test it out. But everybody was working towards that particular end outcome. We set everybody as a goal. We created a strategy. We created all of our goals and outcomes. We cascaded those goals and outcomes through the organization to where all the work units would collectively work together, hopefully to create our organizational outcomes overall that would drive profit for our shareholders. All that was working well, but we had only created an incentive for that, an outcome interdependence from a reward standpoint with our offices. And we didn't get a ton of momentum. We had some improvement in the offices, which was great, but the people who were creating the most value or had the potential to create the most value were out buying product, were selling product, were in the production areas producing our products. And so we tried to balance all that out and figure out, well, what can we afford and what will drive the most value and how do we incentivize these things? We put together an overall organizational profit sharing program that also drove down team incentives as well. And through that reward system, through that outcome interdependence, we drove, and also goal interdependence, that everybody had goals, those drove the outcomes. And through that, we created an incredible amount of value in the organization by getting as much focused, discretional effort, all aimed at the same direction. The last part of this chapter has to do with team composition. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. It's going to be very definitional. I warned you early on in the chapter introduction that this is going to be pretty darn boring. But just know that when we construct our teams, that we have roles that people play, right? So when we're composing a team, we start to you form the team, right? This is going to be the composition. And we define who's going to play lead roles, hopefully, who's going to play some sort of tasks for the team. Just know also that people can go off the rails a little bit and provide individualistic roles that benefit themselves and not the team. The idea is we want to try to hone people into the roles that we define and keep them out of individualistic roles. That's why we also set up boundaries when we talk about forming our team or composing our team. So making sure that we define, what are the lead roles and who's going to play them? What are the tasks that people are going to perform? Maybe what are some of the team building roles that people are going to play? And hopefully when we start seeing individualistic roles creeping up where people are seeking attention for themselves, or they're being the aggressor or being too dominant, in all those cases, if they're performing outside of desired roles, we have ways to hone them in. The next part of composition has to do with the fact that people also bring their personalities to our team. So not only do we have defined roles and people's ability to play those roles, but we also want people who have certain possible personalities to play certain types of roles, right? If you need somebody to be the outspoken speaker of the group, you're probably not going to put an introvert into that position. You're probably going to put more of an extrovert into that position. So people's personalities will influence how the group interacts as well. The next part of team composition has to do with diversity, and I want to encourage you to watch a link to a video that I'm including in this module as well. And that's a link to somebody named Catherine Klein, who's a leading researcher into diversity inclusion and how teams work together and conflict management and things like that. But as you watch that, there's going to be some key terms that I want you to either listen for explicitly, where she actually states them, but I want you to listen to kind of how she references towards a few things as well. So first term is the value and diversity problem solving. So first she's going to talk about that diversity isn't diversity. Like there's different types of diversity. We have surface level diversity, but we also have deep level diversity, and those provide different values and also different challenges as well within a team setting. And they can hopefully help to drive what people perceive or have researched into, which is value and diversity problem solving, this idea that multiple perspectives of people, when they're brought together, can help to shape a better resolution at the end. And then you have something called similarity attraction, where groups of like-minded people have, they can come up with more average results because they aren't as likely to have conflict within their group. So think through that as well. Also think through the term fault lines. So if we try to create value and diversity, one of the issues that can be created is if we don't create an inclusive environment, we might tend to create fault lines in our groups, which might detract from the value that we're trying to create. So think about all those terms: value and diversity, problem solving, similarity attraction. Think of surface level diversity, deep level diversity, think of fault lines, and inclusive behaviors. Well, that's it for team composition. I warned you that it would be a little bit boring. And again, it's a lot of definitions, and that part certainly is boring, but the execution of this is vital to the outcomes of our teams. So if we're thinking through implementing a team, go through this process. Think about, what type of team is it that I'm creating? Am I creating a work group? Am I creating a management team? Am I creating some sort of a parallel team that's meant to go do something? Am I meant to do an action team? What am I trying to create from a type standpoint? And as I think through that, then how am I going to develop my team? How are we going to go through our processes of forming and storming and norming and performing? And then once we get done high-fiving and celebrating and adjourning, Like all that stuff is vital to think through. Or when we hit some sort of period of inertia, how do we evaluate ourselves well enough to go, man, we are not accomplishing what we need to. We need to readjust and find a different way to do things to get better. How do we make sure that we're building vulnerable trust during our development to make sure that we are having constructive conflict so that we can get commitment and accountability and results? All those things are vital from a team development standpoint. How are we making sure that we think through how our team's going to be interdependent upon each other? So are we going to have a team that all works together to problem solve? We're going to have more teams that go out and they all do individual work and we collect all of that. All good to think through. And then that should drive how you compose your team. What sorts of roles are you playing? That's part of your forming, right? And your team development. But also, what types of abilities do we need on our team? To play certain functions within our team and within our organization. All those things are vital to think through as we think about how they're going to impact individual mechanisms and how those will impact overall performance and outcomes. Well, that's it. If you need anything, please feel free to reach out. Peace. Talk to you later.